Lila, thanks so much for joining us to talk about your investigation and tell us a little bit about what you learned. But first, can you introduce yourself to the audience and tell us who you are and how you got involved with this story?
Yeah, no, thank you for having me, Chip. Yeah, I'm an independent investigative reporter. I had been working on the story about ICE shootings for around 4 years. I got started because actually the last time I would argue an ICE shooting made headlines was in February 2020. It was when ICE agents shot a Mexican man in the face in Brooklyn, New York. It also caused widespread protests in the city. It happened really close to home as well because that shooting took place around 10 minutes from my parents' house. And so it felt for the first time in my life really viscerally real and possible that this could happen to another neighbor or to quite literally anybody because Eric Diaz Cruz, was very much like Renee Good in the sense that he was not the target of a law enforcement operation. He was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. So that really started the question of how many other times has this happened this is during the last Trump administration. So I asked ICE to send me records of all of the logs that they had of ICE shootings. They gave me the number but refused to give me the records. And so I brought up a lawsuit against them that lasted 2 years to get all of the records of not just the Trump administration, but also Obama's last year up until Biden, which was the date that they actually finally produced the records. So it took 2 years to get all of those records. And I ended up filing 20 other freedom of information requests to state and local offices to see what the investigation results were. I combined it with media reports. I looked for lawsuits against ICE agents to get names and cases and understand the likelihood of being able to prosecute an ICE agent in a civil lawsuit. And 4 years later, I managed to have the first real reckoning of ICE shootings across the country with a very definitive record of this is what happened in all of them during this time period.
And over the time period that you looked at in total, how many shootings did you identify?
There were 59 shootings. Of those 59 shootings, 23 people were killed and over a dozen people were injured. There were 7 lawsuits. None of them were successful. One of them is still ongoing. The rest have been dismissed. And one was settled, but without admission of wrongdoing from Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And that one case that settled was yet another example of somebody that was shot that wasn't the target of a law enforcement operation. It was a wrongful shooting, but without the admission of guilt or wrongdoing from ICE's part.
So we're talking after last week, an ICE agent in Minneapolis shot a U.S. citizen firing into a moving vehicle, which is something that you looked at in your reporting as well. We'll get to that in a minute. But since then, we've been tracking these shootings and we found that there's been at least 16 in 2025 and so far in 2026. 4 of those 16 shootings have been fatal. When you heard about the news of the shooting of Renee Good, what went through your mind, and did you see any similarities with your reporting and what you uncovered in your investigation?
Yeah, it's so unfortunate to say this, but everything that happened in Minnesota happened before. The shooting of a U.S. citizen, the shooting at a moving vehicle, the shooting in broad daylight in a street where there are other passersby or public, the claim to self-defense. All of this has happened in a myriad of cases, sometimes in all of the above in one case. There was nothing that was shocking to me. Actually, even the fact that now the local or state county attorney's office has backed out of the investigation and the FBI being the sole investigator for any criminal conduct that the ICE agent may have committed is also something that's happened before. And actually in those cases, the result of the investigation never really came out, and the FBI doesn't have an obligation to disclose to the public whether or not they've decided to go with a criminal indictment. So everything that I've seen in Minnesota, I've seen before, and it's unfortunate that if we were to look at the history of ICE shootings and their investigations to say that it's not likely that this is going to be any different.
How frequently did you see in the data that you had, how often did you see shootings into moving vehicles like this? Some of those similarities that you're talking about, how frequently did you see that in the data before?
At least over a dozen times. The shootings that I looked into ended in the year of 2021. So between 2021 and 2026 there, and as you've identified also in your great reporting at The Trace, there have been so many incidents that we are potentially not aware of. And I just feel like it's really important to point out here that both the Department of Homeland Security and the Immigration and Customs Enforcement have use of force policies. In both of these policies, that is a direct violation because this endangers the public. This is something that they are encouraged not to do, not even avoid, but not just encourage them not to do, but tell them to avoid this because it actively endangers the public. And that doesn't seem to be a deterrent at all to ICE's activities. I think that in your reporting as well, you've identified that several of the fatal shootings have been involved with vehicles. So clearly it's not something that intimidates them, and it's also not something that goes punished.
Did you find, I think you might have mentioned this a little bit earlier, but did you find frequent incidents where ICE was not just with moving vehicles, but in general endangering the public and how that they were, using force in these incidents?
It turns out that ICE is quite often disregards the safety of the public when they conduct these shootings. They will do so in parking lots, in strip malls, on highways, at intersections, where a lot of people tend to be at very heavy traffic hours, so often also during the day. Many times they have shot people that were not the target of operation because of an accident. It's incredibly dangerous to shoot in public areas, and that's something that they've done frequently, well over a dozen times. And we're looking at 59 shootings, so if you're looking at over a dozen times, it's still a high percentage of the kind of behavior that they've conducted over the course of these shootings as well. In one case that I looked at, it was in Arizona. They had shot at a man in a driver's seat. Granted, the car was parked at the time, so I just want to be clear about that. But after the shooting, witnesses from stores around them had found that there was a 4-year-old in the back seat that was harmed by the shards of glass that broke through the window. So even if it's not necessarily the people surrounding the incident, there's clearly a disregard for the people that may also be not the target of the law enforcement operation, but still there.
I'm curious if you saw any kind of patterns in the type of enforcement activities that the ICE agents were, or the immigration agents were conducting when these incidents happened. Because I think right now we're seeing or for the last year or so since President Trump came back into office, an increase in immigration enforcement, raids, different types of activities in cities across the country. Do you see any patterns with the type of enforcement activities that these agents are doing that result in shootings?
I have actually an opposite answer to pattern in this case, and it's that there is really such a variety of things that ICE could be doing because they have both the enforcement and removal operations officers, and then they also have the Homeland Security investigation. So really the gamut of what ICE covers is so broad and ever broadening, actually, because now they're also becoming protest control and patrolling in ways that they never had to before with U.S. citizens and out of investigations and special operations. So it's really difficult to pinpoint exactly what ICE is doing at any time. And the way that these shootings occur also happen with the breadth of all of the different responsibilities that ICE agents have. And actually, there were 11 shootings where officers were off duty entirely. So there was no law enforcement operation at all. They just happened to use their ICE-issued gun to shoot at somebody. And so it's so difficult for me to point at the patterns, but I would say that ICE, unless the presidential administration decided to suddenly curtail the mandate of ICE, they're going to continue to operate in this wide breadth of activities. What matters is if they're ever going to get in trouble for these kinds of actions.
So you found that not a single indictment resulted from any of these incidents, but did you see any other type of accountability for the officers, or how did these incidents turn out? Were there investigations? What did that look like?
Well, something to point out before we even talk about an investigation regarding ICE agents is that this is an agency that's incredibly shrouded with secrecy. There's no obligation for ICE to release their internal investigations into an agent. The DHS similarly doesn't have any obligations. Really, the only way that we could find out the fate of an investigation would be with state and local prosecutors. And even then, you'd have to FOIA for the documents if it's not already publicly available, if there wasn't a press conference because there was some sort of scandal or public reckoning. So being able to piece together the information that I needed to be able to say that line was quite difficult and actually took the duration of the investigation itself, 4 years, to understand what DHS, ICE, state and local prosecutors, and civil lawsuits might all amount to. What I found was that it's incredibly difficult to know if an ICE agent would be disciplined, but not only that, it's incredibly easy for an ICE agent to sort of evade discipline, even internally. So the Department of Homeland Security Inspector General Office might investigate if there's allegations of misconduct, but they don't necessarily have to. In any case, ICE's Office of Public Responsibility is going to investigate the situation regardless of whether or not the IG's office investigates. But again, they're not going to necessarily have to make those investigations public. What that office does is if it will make discipline recommendations as needed. The problem is what I found from a government accountability report of looking into use of force policies within the DHS is that if the OPR, so the Office of Public Responsibility, makes a recommendation for discipline, that recommendation goes down to the supervisor. The supervisor can decide whether or not to actually implement that discipline. So ultimately, there could be a review and there could be a recommendation for discipline, but a discipline doesn't happen because the supervisor doesn't deem it warranted. Even if a supervisor deemed it warranted, a former special agent with Homeland Security investigations told me that the agent can appeal. So it's not necessarily something that will happen right away. And even the ICE agent has a say in their own discipline. So getting to the point of where an ICE agent actually experiences discipline is something that can take years if it happens at all. And when I spoke to the author of the government accountability report that looked into the use of force policies and had access to the agency in a way that the layperson like you and I would never have, she had told me that she wasn't aware of anybody ever being fired. So this is one insight in what it looks like. The state and local prosecutors, when they're investigating for criminal conduct, had a lot of inconsistencies from state to state about whether or not they believe they even had jurisdiction to investigate a federal agent. There was one case in Virginia, actually, that kind of fell into the unknown, into the status of the unknown, because the state attorney's office started to investigate, stopped pretty abruptly and decided they didn't have investigation, still wrote an opinion that the state doesn't have grounds to prosecute a federal agent, and the case went to the FBI, very similar to what happened in Minneapolis. There have been several cases that I looked at least four, many of them in Arizona, where ICE agents actually hindered the investigation of state and local prosecutors. They either didn't stay on the scene to give statements, or they encouraged one another not to give statements to the local prosecutors. The last pathway to accountability that could possibly be perceived as a private civil lawsuit, but the likelihood of that succeeding is incredibly slim. So it's a very, very, when we're talking about accountability for ICE agents, I don't really know what that looks like because there isn't really a precedent for it. I wasn't able to find one.
From your perspective, having reported about this extensively, what do you think real accountability would look like for ICE agents who do shootings like this?
It's hard to say because, like I mentioned earlier, it's really hard to say. I don't know what accountability even looks like because in all of the years I've looked at these shootings, none of them have really amounted to discipline that I can point towards, or a criminal charge, or a successful lawsuit, even in the cases where people were killed, even in the cases where U.S. citizens were killed. And again, I don't say that lightly because I don't think that it's fair to differentiate between U.S. citizens and undocumented immigrants. Everybody is entitled to constitutional rights here in the United States as long as they're on the soil of the United States. So when you ask me what I think accountability should look like, it's not so much up to me. It's kind of up to Congress and their oversight over ICE, which has not reined in their tactics at all. It's up to the presidential administration to also oversee the behavior in the field, but also in the detention centers. And it's very much up to the state and local prosecutors to investigate potential homicides in their states and in their cities. And even in the cases where ICE agents violated protocols, like if there was no criminal activity in the actual shooting themselves, if they've violated protocols, to perhaps see consequences for that. I cannot point to you an example of an ICE agent suffering consequences for the shooting. The only consequence that they had suffered is potentially a lawsuit against them. But a lawsuit against them is not likely to succeed. So it's so hard for me to say. I don't think it's up for me to decide, but I have now pointed out to you all of the bodies that could and actively choose not to.
One last thing, you were mentioning earlier this kind of false narrative that has been going around comparing, talking about citizen versus non-citizen ICE shootings. Are there any other things that you're seeing in the media coverage that you wanna address, or that you think is missing from the media coverage of this incident?
Yeah, no, thank you for asking that. Really, I am glad that we are all focusing on this right now and that we are trying to get to the bottom of the roots of such violence and that we are recognizing such violence with the gravity that it should be. But like I mentioned, nothing in this shooting is new. I can't identify from the actual circumstance of the shooting to the now unraveling of the investigation and the FBI taking sole custody of it. None of this is new. All of this has happened before. And I think media needs to, yes, reconstruct the events, but not focus so much on doing that and ask bigger questions like, how did we get here? And what standards can we hold ICE agents to? Why do we not have access to the use of force policies? And why did the use of force policies get updated time and again, very belatedly, might I add? For over a decade, ICE was operating on an interim 2004, so the year after the establishment of the Department of Homeland Security, use of force policy that experts and even the Inspector General of the DHS found was incredibly outdated and didn't incorporate best lessons for how to operate in the field. So we should, as journalists, be asking questions about access to documents, access to investigations within ICE, larger questions like you're asking me about accountability and what that really looks like, and really holding state and local prosecutors to the fullest of their obligations. Yes, right now in Minneapolis, the state prosecutors have said that the FBI is withholding valuable investigative material from them, but that doesn't absolve them of their right to conduct their own homicide investigation. They can still do that. They don't have to only jointly operate with the FBI. They have something called dual sovereignty. So asking the really tough questions about where this is going and is everybody abiding by the standards that they should with investigations is the biggest question. And actually delving into the history like I did for 4 years is incredibly important. It can't fall on just journalists like myself that commit for 4 years. I was an independent journalist. I didn't necessarily have the resources at all times during this 4 years, even though I had incredible support from TYPE, from the Trace, from the Fund for Investigative Journalism. But it shouldn't fall on one independent journalist to do this kind of research. And likewise, we shouldn't only be doing this when awful things happen. This happens all the time. Like I mentioned, there are some shootings that didn't have any record of existence until I got the ICE logs. So this is not something that we take our foot off the pedal. This is something that we should be looking into all the time. Many of the experts that I spoke to when I asked them about why ICE can get away with such violence told me it's because there's no congressional committee, no presidential administration, and also no media that's committed to this kind of coverage all the time. This is not something that we should forget the next time and until the next time an ICE agent shoots somebody and kills somebody. This is something that we should be focusing on all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Lila, thank you so much for joining us and walking us through this.
No, thank you for having me, Chip. This was really helpful.